The Indian subcontinent in the early centuries BC was a land of empires. Notably, the Indian Nanda Empire sprawled across the northern portion while butting up against the lands of the ambitious and unrelenting Alexander the Great, at least for the time being. Legend has it that the fate of the Nanda Empire was sealed a good time before its true collapse by a man known as Chanukya. A teacher, philosopher, and generally a jack of all trades, Chanukya traveled to Pataliputra for his occupation, but at some point, while there, had a falling out with the emperor himself. Chanukya was deeply troubled by what occurred between himself and Dhanananda, and thus swore that, as revenge, he would bring about the collapse of this empire entirely. And as crazy as this sounds, he wouldn't really be wrong. Having escaped Dhanananda and fled to Taxila, Chanukya stumbled upon a man by the name of Chandra Gupta Maurya. He and some other young men were playing a game, essentially of role-playing a battle, which piqued Chanukya's interest. Something that he saw in the boy gave him the impression that Chandra Gupta not only excelled at the game, but he may just excel at something quite similar in real life. As the might and influence of Alexander the Great began to fade, as would his life, Chandra Gupta, advised by none other than Chanukya, would start looking to take some of the territories the Macedonian was losing. By the time of Alexander's death in 323 BC, Maurya, with the vengeful Chanukya in his ear, was nearly ready to fill the power vacuum that would be left behind. The exact details of how Chanukya led Chandra Gupta to conquer the Nanda Empire aren't exactly clear, but what is certain is that it did happen. And by 321 BC, Chandra Gupta was the new ruler of the newfound the Maurya Empire. In his early years as emperor, Chandra Gupta continued to focus on the old territories of Alexander the Great. In the final years of the 4th century BC, the new emperor thus waged war against the remnants of Alexander's empire, aiming to capture some of the previously annexed satrapies and surrounding domains. By 303 BC, one of the Macedonian's generals and successors, Seleucus I Nicator, was forced to sign a peace treaty with Chandragupta as the Maurya Empire pressed outward. From there, the Indian leader aimed to not only conquer the lands of the Greeks, but furthermore to form diplomatic relations with those he didn't invade, something which he was quite successful at as well. Overall, Chandragupta Maurya was a good leader. He established a strong, centralized authority, gave his empire a reputation of being freedom-loving, and managed to build a large kingdom from scratch. But in 297 BC, the first ruler of the Maurya Empire decided to call it quits. For religious reasons, Chandragupta handed over the empire to his son, Bindusara. The latter, being only in his early 20s, would expand his father's empire down south all the way to modern-day Karnataka. During his reign, nearly all of India would become part of the Maurya Empire, marking an impressive first for the subcontinent. Aside from back-to-back revolts in Taxila, Bindusara doesn't seem to have faced many challenges during his time as emperor either, although his life was not very well documented in general. His life would also end at some point during the 270s BC, at which point it's believed that a battle for succession followed for a few years. As Bindusara's son duked it out for the throne, a victor would finally emerge, and that victor would be the now famous Ashoka. The empire would stabilize and find its new leader in the form of Ashoka around 270 BC, and thus the most stunning period of Maurya history began. At first, he was viewed with heavy skepticism. Having shown his ability to be cruel when it came to the war against his own brothers, many found their new leader to be a serious concern. But Ashoka couldn't be bothered, as he was much too busy with a goal that so far the Maurya had failed to achieve, annexing the territory of Kalinga. As the 260s BC came to a close, spectacularly, Ashoka managed to do just that. However, in a surprising turn of events, the emperor began to feel deep remorse for what he had done. Roughly 100,000 men, including civilians, lost their lives in his war for Kalinga, and tens of thousands more were displaced or otherwise affected. As the guilt began to weigh on the ruler, he started to turn toward Buddhism for answers. Policies and functions of the empire would soon reflect this, and Ashoka himself put his feelings into words, which would then become edicts essentially plastered all throughout the empire. This new shift in emotions and faith not only proved to be an integral part of the spread of Buddhism, but it also marked a period of non-violence and subsequently no new expansion. When Ashoka died in 232 BC, none of his sons were able to take over the throne. One had died, another was blind, a third we don't much know about, and another was busy spreading their shared religion. This resulted in Ashoka's grandson, Dasharatha, succeeding him instead. Dasharatha was not a horrible ruler, but he wasn't necessarily a powerful one either. Under Ashoka's grandson, many of the territories previously conquered by the Maurya were lost, and this is generally viewed as the early decline of the empire. However, Dashrath would eventually be succeeded by his cousin, Samprati, who managed to regain the lost lands and temporarily restabilize the empire. The Mauryas, in the long run, couldn't maintain anything that Samprati had done, nevertheless. Instead, Samprati's son and successor, Seleucus, would begin a string of markedly weak rulers, himself being described as quarrelsome and unrighteous by the Yuga Purana. Seleucus would then be followed by Deva Varman, who ruled until 195 BC and may have been more impressive than his predecessor, but still failed to hold the empire to the standards of Ashoka and all those before him. And to be fair, neither could his own successor, Shatadhanavan. The latter ruled from 195 BC to 187 BC and would be the final monarch before the one who would end it all. Brihadratha Maurya was the last emperor of the Maurya Empire. At some time during the 180s BC, Brihadratha, the last of the emperors, is believed to have been attending a military parade led by one of his top generals, Pushyamitra Shunga. He, though, was not a reliable nor loyal general, and his parade was meant to display his might and authority to his supposed ruler. During the festivities, he assassinated Emperor Brihadratha Maurya in one motion, bringing about the sudden and heavy fall of the Maurya Empire. The end of Brihadratha's reign and the empire as a whole would be followed by the establishment of Pushyamitra's Shunga Empire. Unfortunately, due to the time period and circumstances of the empire's existence, we can't know much for certain. However, there are some clear contributing factors that would have ultimately led to the Maurya downfall. For one, Ashoka, though an icon and hero to many, was not a conqueror in his later years. Despite being an impressive one at the start of his reign, his unwillingness to do much through warfare undeniably paused any expansion until his death. But then again, while expansion worked for some empires, maybe it wouldn't have for the Mauryas. The idea that the empire was already too vast to strongly maintain is a valid theory, though that would still depend on who was at the helm of the imperial dynasty. And after Ashoka, the leaders were particularly the issue. His sons weren't even able to take the throne, and his grandsons were not as exceptional as himself nor his own predecessors. Still, foreign invaders, specifically the Greeks, did their own damage to the empire after Ashoka's death, which only made a hard job harder for weak rulers. And with all of this combined, in addition to the level of autonomy that some of the provinces within the empire had, it's no surprise that internal strife and rebellions began to pop up. These, predictably, were not easily crushed by incapable leaders, and thus the pressure was building as the Maurya Empire's collapse neared. At the end of the day, it's hard to pin the fall on one or even just two things. The simplest way to put it, however, would likely be the fact that after Ashoka, the empire was plagued with weak and poor leadership.